Welcome to this explainer on Erik Larson's incredible book, Dead Wake. Today, we're diving straight into the visceral reality and the complex historical truths behind the 1915 sinking of the Lusitania. So if you think you know the full story of this famous ocean liner, well, prepare to have your perspective totally shifted.
You probably remember sitting in history class and hearing that the sinking of the Lusitania was the exact spark that pulled the U.S. into World War I, right? We all kind of remember it being this simple point A to point B narrative. The ship went down, and boom, the U.S. went to war. But as this comprehensive review of Dead Wake reveals, that is actually a massive misconception, and we're going to correct the record today.
To set things straight, here's our roadmap. First, we'll tackle dispelling that historical myth. Second, we'll look at the macro warfare versus the micro lives of the people involved. And finally, we'll wrap up by examining Larson's masterful historical storytelling.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, dispelling a historical myth, specifically looking at the timeline of U.S. entry into the war.
Let's actually think about the timeline for a second. The Lusitania was sunk by German submarines in early May of 1915. But the U.S., we didn't actually enter the war until 1917, after the interception of the infamous Zimmermann telegrams.
That's 2 whole years. Literally 24 months passed between the tragedy of the Lusitania and American troops actually getting involved in World War I. It's kind of unsettling to realize how wrong our basic historical assumptions can be, isn't it? This gap often gets totally glossed over in school, but understanding it completely changes how we view the political climate of the time. The sinking was an absolute tragedy, no doubt about it, but it wasn't the immediate overnight trigger for war that we've always been led to believe.
Okay, moving into part 2, macro warfare and micro lives. Let's explore how Larson perfectly balances massive global stakes with incredibly intimate human experiences.
The really crucial thing to understand here is the sheer strategic dominance of the German U-boats. Submarines weren't just some experimental novelty back then. They radically changed the entire landscape of naval warfare. They were devastating merchant vessels at an alarming rate, effectively suffocating England's economy by just cutting off their supply lines. The source material highlights a pretty terrifying reality. Without eventual U.S. involvement, Germany could have absolutely won the war based purely on their submarine supremacy.
Now, what's really fascinating is that Larson doesn't just treat the German forces like faceless cartoon villains. He gives us this incredibly rare, impartial look at what life was actually like for the German U-boat crew that sank the Lusitania. It's so uncommon in nonfiction war books to see both sides captured this way. He brings us right inside those cramped, tense metal tubes, emphasizing that these guys were just fighting the same war, speaking a different language, and just happened to be on a different side.
And this is exactly what makes Larson's macro to micro storytelling so brilliant. It's like a giant puzzle. He flawlessly bounces us back and forth between the high-level political chess game, like Woodrow Wilson sitting safely in the White House, agonizing over whether to enter the war, and the sheer ground-level terror for an individual passenger like Theodate Pope out there on the water. You get the massive global sphere and the deeply personal terror side by side, and you really need both to understand the full picture of 1915.
But it's not just politics. The author meticulously reconstructs the human element aboard that ship. You aren't just reading a dry passenger manifest. You really get to know Captain Turner and the heavy burden he carried commanding the vessel. You follow the individual journeys of passengers like Theodate Pope and Grace French. You find out exactly what they were thinking, what their lives were like leading up to the voyage, and what they were feeling in real time.
Larson's research skills are literally off the charts here. He didn't just figure out who was on the ship. He dug up hyper-specific atmospheric details. We're talking about knowing the exact clothing and jewelry the passengers chose to wear that specific morning. It might sound like an overwhelming amount of detail, but it paints such a painstaking picture. You walk away fundamentally feeling what it was like to live, breathe, and dress back in 1915.
And because you become so deeply invested in these people, when the ship finally goes down, the tragedy hits you like a ton of bricks. It is incredibly emotional. Reading that there were, quote, dozens and dozens and dozens of bodies in the ocean carries this massive somber weight. You aren't just looking at a cold historical statistic anymore. You're witnessing the sudden, heartbreaking end of the vivid lives you just spent chapters getting to know.
Which brings us to our final section, masterful historical storytelling. Let's see how all of this amazing research comes together as a piece of nonfiction craft.
Dead Wake really stands out even when you compare it to Larson's other famous works. For example, take Devil in the White City. The reviewer we're looking at felt that one had some definite pacing issues, earning it 3 stars. But Dead Wake? It gets a solid 4 stars because it takes all those wildly different elements, the U-boat crew, the president, the passengers, and weaves them into a single cohesive narrative arc that flows absolutely flawlessly without ever feeling disjointed.
So, wrapping this all up, it really begs a provocative question. How much of the history we're taught is just a glossed-over myth? If the textbook story of the Lusitania is this fundamentally wrong, what else is out there waiting to be corrected? If you're interested in World War I, or if you just love brilliantly researched history that totally flips the script on what you thought you knew, Dead Wake is an absolute must-read. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the history you think you know.